welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. This week, maybe you're not old enough, or maybe you are, to recall the horrible serial killings in eastern Connecticut in the 1980s. They were committed by a man named Michael Ross. He raped and strangled 8 women to death before his spree came to an end. And he was the last person to be put to death in Connecticut before capital punishment was abolished. Now, there was no doubt about his guilt. The only question was whether he was legally insane, which would have stopped any application of capital punishment. Well, our guest today is a retired journalist who spent 10 years of her life getting to know Ross while he was on death row. In fact, she spent more time speaking with him than anybody else, including his family. Martha Elliott wrote a book about this, The Man in the Monster. She's going to be along in just a moment to share her recollections and insights. A special warning, though, this episode contains some rather strong ideas and commentary, and it may not be appropriate for all age groups. This week's trivia question: if we talk about the Battle of Chancellorsville, which war are we discussing? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know what we're talking about next week. Now, before we get going with today's episode, I just want to repeat my warning from the introduction. There are some pretty heavy ideas in this episode, and it just may not be appropriate for all age groups, so please bear that warning before you listen. In the 1980s, eastern Connecticut was rocked by a series of murders of women. Most of them were quite young. Including one death that occurred in New York State, the total victim count was 8. Now, in all the cases, Michael Ross found a woman walking alone, grabbed her, dragged her to a remote location, sometimes in his car, abused her sexually, and then strangled her to death. He would then hide the body. Psychiatrists later stated that Michael suffered from a condition that is known as sexual sadism. It's a very rare condition, and in his case, the cause was not entirely clear, although, as you're going to hear, there are several reasons that seem particularly suspect. Michael Ross was known as the Eggman Murderer. That's because he grew up on the family's chicken farm in Putnam in the rural northeast corner of the state. It was his love of that farm that led him to attend Cornell University in New York State, where he studied agriculture. He actually wanted nothing more than to earn his degree there and return to the farm and drive it to the next level of success. It was after he left for Cornell and was no longer troubled by the incredibly challenging home life he suffered as a child, especially with respect to his mother, that his behavior started to change. His first murder would occur in his senior year, just before he graduated, but the signs were there long before that. The other 7 murders occurred over 3 years after he left college. Now, the purpose of this episode is not to focus on the horrible activities that occurred. Rather, it's to hear from the former journalist who became very interested in the case and wound up actually befriending Ross while he was on death row. Martha Elliott, in fact, spent more time talking with Michael Ross than even his own family. Martha taught at the Columbia Journalism School, and at the time this case caught her attention, she was the editor of the Connecticut Law Tribune. She's strongly opposed to the death penalty, and it was Michael's handling of the court actions surrounding his pending execution and his formal rights to appeal it that drew Martha to the case. What's fascinating about her book, where she details the decade of her interactions with Michael Ross, is how you get to peer inside Ross and see the side of the human who's actually not a killer, but rather a person with everyday thoughts, concerns, and an uncanny understanding of the difference between right and wrong. So, Martha, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and I have so many questions. This is such an interesting case, and your perspective on it is there's nobody else's that could anywhere come close to what you experienced, what you saw, what you know, what you feel, and we're going to go through all that. It's hard to know where to start in this discussion, but what I thought we would start off with is a quick discussion and summary of his childhood life with his mom and his dad and growing up on the chicken farm. A lot of things there that, certainly seem to have played into what ended up happening to Michael when he, went off on his criminal campaign. But what would you say, looking back on it, were kind of the highlights of his childhood?
Well, I think his mother had some severe mental illness, and I think that that affected all the children, but perhaps Michael most because he was the reason that she had to get married. She got pregnant before she married Dan Ross, and she resented him for that. She had 3 more kids in fairly rapid succession, and she was trapped in a small town, and she took a lot out of it on him. What would happen would be that something would transpire. She would tell the kids that they were in trouble. When Dan came home, she would tell him that he needed to discipline them. So he would send them out to the woodshed to find a switch, and then they were punished.
So now we have the mother who was pregnant out of wedlock. That is her first child, and that's Michael Ross. She has 3 more. She has a horrible temper. She's institutionalized twice. As you said, she commandeered everything and arranged for discipline, punishment, whatever it was. The father was sort of made to do this by the mother, so she kind of, no pun intended, but ran the roost there in terms of the at the egg farm complex, and really what she said went right.
Oh, yeah, definitely what she said. She ruled the roost. As Michael later said, he didn't blame his father because he felt his father was as henpecked as they were. And I met Dan. He was the only one of the whole family who would go and visit Michael. It might have only been once a year or even less, but at the end, he didn't want to be rid of Michael by having him basically give up appeals. He really wanted Michael to live.
I think what's important to know is here's a guy who was trying to escape this family upbringing, and it was, by all accounts in your book, was just a horrendous upbringing, and he wanted nothing more than to be able to go to school. He was a very bright guy, it turns out, an IQ of over 120, and he wanted to go to Cornell, a great agricultural school, get a degree, and come back and run the egg farm. That's what he wanted to do. So he heads off to Cornell, and one of the things he did, and I think in reading your book, I found myself wanting to pick up little clues about, gee, why did he do this? What sent him off the rails and made him do this? And obviously, the treatment by his mother is one thing that sticks out. But he also was taking Ritalin through his childhood, and he took himself off it as he went to college. Did you ever hear from any of the doctors? I understand that's not something you would normally be advised to do.
No, it's not something you would be advised to do. Even today, people who are ADHD, they can't just drop off of their medication. They need to be weaned off of it. He had been on it for so long that I think that was a huge problem for him. Whether it made him depressed, no matter what it did, I don't know. From what I understand, it helped him to control his behavior for a while. And when he went off of it, he had a number of things going on. One is he was away from his mother, who controlled him. And 2, he had all these other sexual stimuli going on. He was meeting women he was attracted to. All those things were way too many things going on for him at the same time.
So as you say, he had so many things going on, and one of the things he does is he meets his first girlfriend out of 2 that he would meet at Cornell, and he ends up in his sophomore year when he's 19 years old getting her pregnant, and then feels terribly guilty because he didn't really support her the way that he thought he should have supported her. And it's around this time that he also begins to stalk women. So it's almost like he's coming into this new, monster stage that would emerge from him and control him.
He was away from his mother, who controlled him. So all the controlling things that had been in his life were gone. You know, his freshman year in college, he dated all the time. It was a totally new thing. He hadn't done any of that. And I asked Dr. Berlin, who was one of the psychiatrists who had studied him the most and who had the most experience with people who had these kind of disorders, about that. And he said, you know, there's no way to know what caused what. Like, for instance, you didn't ask me about his killing the chickens, the baby chicks, when he was 8 years old, but he admits there could have been some psychosexual connection with that, but he doesn't know it. Michael never mentioned being eroticized by that. So he had all these sexual drives. Who knows what caused what?
Yeah, you're right. It's darn near impossible to pinpoint something, and it's just there's so many different variables.
And that's what I was trying to say. There's so many different things that add into it. What was clear later, I think, was that when he had things that upset him, it then led him to killing somebody. When he had a fight with a girlfriend, when his father said he couldn't bring his girlfriend to Thanksgiving, you know, whatever it was, when it was something that totally frustrated him, he ended up killing somebody.
You know, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is the pattern. And what also amazed me, you know, over the course of his criminal life, the number of times that police were onto him. In other words, he got caught on one occasion and ended up with a 2-year suspended sentence. He got caught another time assaulting a woman in her abode and ends up getting a 6-month sentence, which I guess he got out early because of good behavior. He had buried one of the victims on the family farm in a remote section. And it just, nobody seemed to be putting the pieces together and realizing this guy was the sort of linchpin behind all of it. Did that strike you as something that was unusual?
I think his mother might have had a suspicion about him. I'm not sure about his father, but, you know, if they did, they didn't want to admit to it. I mean, who wants to admit that your kid could be a killer? The thing is that even today, you can watch cop shows on TV and they'll tell you about how there's not enough communication between states or jurisdictions in order for them to figure out that there's patterns. Back then, before computers, I mean, every single police report on him was all handwritten and put in a file. There was no way that anybody was making this connection. The trooper Malchik says he put it together or suspected there might be a serial killer beforehand, or there might be connections between some of the murders. But, you know, I don't know whether that was, how much of that was him trying to take credit for it or what.
Well, after the 8th and final murder, Malchik, there had been people who saw the car and had a good description of Michael Ross.
Oh, the 8th one, it was in broad daylight. There was a whole bunch of people who saw him turn around, saw him get out of the car, saw him follow the woman down the road, and Michael was trying to get caught. No police can take credit for making some, oh, look at this, must be the serial killer guy.
Well, to your point, I mean, didn't he go over to Michael's house with all this information that pointed to Michael? And if I read that passage of your book correctly, it sounded like maybe you were inferring that Malchik was about to leave without necessarily being convinced until Michael started dropping hints. Do I have that right?
He did go over to his house because someone had given a very detailed description of the car. And then that person had not only given a detailed description of the car, but had gone to a dealer and looked up the color and the type of car and tried to figure out what year it could have been, and then told the state police his findings. He did all the footwork for the state police. Then Malchik went around and started knocking on doors based on the information that they had. And one of the first doors that they knocked on was Michael's. And because Michael had his glasses on and the description of the person was not with glasses on, he didn't think it was the right guy and he was going to leave. But Michael wanted to be caught. And every time Malchik went to leave, he dropped a crumb, which made Malchik ask a few more questions. And eventually he was taken in and he confessed.
At Michael's first trial, we had this prosecutor who was late in his career, Bob Saty, who may have cut some corners, right? In particular, the psychiatric report that he withheld, right?
Here's what happened. The defense had many psychiatrists evaluate Michael. The prosecution had one, a Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller initially agreed with Bob Saty that he wasn't insane. But after looking at the record and seeing how many bodies there were, Dr. Miller wrote Saty a letter which said, I can no longer go along with your position and say that he deserves the death penalty. Then Saty did everything he could to keep that out of the record, and the way he did it was to not ask him a single question about Michael specifically. And the judge went along with it too, and they tried to keep all of that information about Dr. Miller's diagnosis from the jury. And it took the jury 87 minutes to say he wasn't insane. And then it took them maybe a day to give him the death penalty, but according to Michael, he could hear him laughing in the jury room, so he thinks they only waited longer so that it wouldn't seem like they had jumped to conclusions.
And just so people understand, and to put a fine point on this, if he was legally insane in the eyes of the law, they could not have executed him, right?
No, there's two different things. I think in every state, the process is bifurcated. The first one is to find out whether you're insane legally, and that is rarely found. I mean, literally, people have to be unaware of who they are, and they're unable to understand who they are. But after that, there's another point. And at the time in Connecticut, according to the law, if you had mental illness that contributed to why you killed the person, you couldn't be executed. So technically, he could have been found guilty, but not given the death penalty. But here's the problem. Dr. Miller, the state psychiatrist, said because there's so many bodies, I think he shouldn't get the death penalty because obviously he's mentally ill. But people who have no training in psychiatry or psychology are the ones who are making the judgment. They're also under a great deal of pressure because here you have someone who is considered a monster. You know, you have their families out in the courtroom and they're under a lot of pressure. And the fact that there are so many bodies makes them think that they should be punished. And so what should show that they have a mental illness is what actually gets them to get the death penalty.
So if we could take just a second to have you explain how you got from sort of a casual interest in the case as it crossed your desk and you learned of it to actually meeting Michael Ross. This was not an easy process, was it?
It wasn't an easy process, but it happened much faster than I ever thought it would. He wrote an article in the Hartford Courant. Basically what had transpired was that he was saying, I don't want to have another trial, you can just kill me. That bothered me because, A, I'm against the death penalty, have been my whole life. I was brought up to think that killing was wrong, no matter who did it. And I thought what Michael Ross did was wrong, but I didn't think that that meant that somebody else should kill him. So I wrote him a letter because I was skeptical. Was he really serious about giving up his life? Or was this like a publicity stunt? What was going on? So I said, will you be willing to be interviewed? Within a week, he wrote back. When the letter came to me at the Law Tribune, I was so scared even to open it, because to me, the idea of a serial killer, the idea of any kind of killer was absolutely terrifying. And I opened it. He said he wanted to do it. I wrote back to him, and it took literally 5 or 6 months for me to be able to even talk to him. And that was only because I met his former jury consultant at one of his pretrial hearings on this issue of giving up his second trial. And she invited me to be in her office in New York City when he was calling. And that was the first time I talked to him. But I was terrified even to talk to him on the phone, even though he was 250 miles away. It took a long time for me to feel comfortable to talk to him, never mind to go and see him at the prison. I mean, it was a couple years before I felt really comfortable having him call me and talk to him and be able to talk to him like I talk to anybody on the phone. I can't tell you when that happened, but it did happen over time. I was no longer afraid of him. I knew he wouldn't hurt me. I interviewed him and talked to him for maybe 6, 7, 8 months, and then I wrote a very long article, like a magazine-style article for the paper. After that, I had planned to stop talking to him, but he kept calling me, and I knew he didn't have anybody to call. He talked to his father maybe once a year, and there were very few people who would take his call other than his jury consultant. So I would take his call. I had no intention of talking to him for 10 years, but that's what ended up happening.
You say something in your book, which I just want to point out to the listeners. You said that you set out to meet a monster, but you met a man. Could you explain that?
I thought of him as a monster. I was terrified of him. I mean, if you're afraid to open a letter from somebody, imagine talking to him on the phone, imagine meeting him in person. I wanted to understand what this monster who had raped and murdered 8 women, why he was willing to die, and I also wanted to understand why he did it. I wanted to see if I thought he was mentally ill. I, over time, got to understand that he was not, the kind of cliche that you see on TV about serial killers who are frothing at the mouth or who are really scary human beings. I mean, he was on medication. I knew he would never hurt me. I knew he even knew he couldn't ever leave prison because he knew that he needed to be confined in order to not hurt anybody else. And he was okay with that. He also knew that he could help people if he lived. He could help people get their GEDs. He could help, and he did help counsel people who had the same kind of mental illness as him. He wanted to do positive things to make up for the bad things he did.
On the one hand, he wanted, and I think you said that Michael Ross felt that God had forgiven him, but what he really wanted was for the parents to believe or understand that the monster inside him was a mental illness, not really the Michael Ross, that Michael Ross would have never done this. It was this monster he couldn't control. What were your impressions of that?
It's very important to understand that Michael bifurcated those two parts of him. That there was a monster, and then there was Michael. He He thought Michael was a good person. The monster was what made him do those things. He really hoped that by volunteering to die, that the families of the victims would forgive him. That was what his ultimate goal was.
Well, Michael had the right to appeal his death sentence, but he declined to do so, and this despite the urging of Martha and even Michael's father, who had asked her if she could convince him to appeal. Well, she says she was powerless and unable to change his mind. On May 13th, 2005, Michael Ross was executed by lethal injection. Martha Elliott flew from California, where she was living at the time, to the state prison in Somers, where the execution occurred, to be a witness. She had promised Michael she would do so. It was the first and only time Connecticut used lethal injection, and it was the last time the state executed an inmate before eliminating the death penalty. Wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Martha Elliott. She's author of the riveting book, The Man in the Monster. It's the story of her decade-long association with the notorious serial killer Michael Ross. Her book is a highly skillful reconstruction of the entire case. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, if we talk about the Battle of Chancellorsville, which war are we discussing? Well, the answer, of course, is the Civil War. And next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to have a special recounting of a Connecticut man who fought at that bloody battle, was captured, was let go, but then faced the ultimate fates. All of these stories we have thanks to the letters he wrote to his wife. Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.